From the dawn of humankind, as civilizations began to blossom, a dark shadow emerged alongside. This shadow, cast by the practice of slavery, has stretched across millennia. It has touched every corner of the globe, leaving an indelible mark on human history. Slavery, in its various forms, has been a constant companion to societal development. Why was this brutal system so pervasive? The answer lies in the complex interplay of power, economics, and cultural beliefs. Throughout history, societies have grappled with the idea of human ownership, exploiting their fellow beings for personal gain. The desire for cheap labor, for dominance, and for control fueled the engine of slavery. This dark chapter of our past is not merely an academic exercise, it is a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. But it is also a story of resilience, of resistance, and ultimately of hope. By understanding the roots of slavery, we can better confront its modern manifestations. This is the story of slavery from its ancient origins to its present-day forms. It is a story that demands to be told, a story that compels us to act. The echoes of forced labor reverberate through time. Ancient civilizations, for all their advancements, bear the stain of slavery. In the bustling marketplaces of ancient Rome, human beings were bought and sold alongside livestock and spices. Across the Mediterranean, the grandeur of ancient Greece was built on the backs of slaves who toiled in mines and fields. In the East, the dynasties of China and the empires of India all relied on various forms of servitude and forced labor. The misconception that slavery was confined to a particular race or region is a dangerous fallacy. From the bustling cities of the Middle East to the pre-Columbian Americas, slavery transcended geographical boundaries and ethnic divisions. It was a system ingrained in the fabric of many societies, a tragic testament to the universality of human greed and the vulnerability of the powerless. Slavery, in essence, became a global pandemic. It infected societies across continents, each adapting and evolving the practice to suit their own needs and justifications. While the forms of slavery differed, the underlying theme remained constant: the subjugation of one human by another. This exploitation was often rationalized and justified through cultural beliefs and societal norms. Slaves were seen as tools of production, as spoils of war, or even as possessions to be traded or inherited. Religion was often used to legitimize the practice, with scriptures misinterpreted to condone the ownership of human beings. These justifications, however flawed, underscore the deeply ingrained nature of slavery. It was not merely an economic system, but a social and cultural institution woven into the very tapestry of human civilization. The shimmering waters of the Nile, a cradle of civilization, also bore witness to the plight of slaves in ancient Egypt. The majestic pyramids, enduring symbols of Egyptian ingenuity, were constructed with the sweat and toil of countless laborers. While debate continues among scholars about the exact nature of their servitude, it is clear that a hierarchical system existed, with forced labor playing a significant role. Slaves, often captives of war or victims of debt, were employed in various sectors of Egyptian society. They toiled in fields, served in households, and even worked as artisans and craftsmen. Despite their contributions, their lives were marked by hardship and lack of freedom. The pharaoh, considered a living god, held absolute power, and the lives of slaves were entirely at the mercy of their masters. The echoes of their plight, etched in stone and papyrus, serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of empire and the enduring legacy of slavery. Section 2. Glory and Servitude. Slavery in Ancient Greece and Rome. Across the Mediterranean, the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome, celebrated for their intellectual and architectural achievements, were also deeply reliant on slave labor. In Athens, the birthplace of democracy, slavery was an integral part of the social and economic fabric. Slaves worked in mines, on farms, and in households, providing the foundation for the Athenian economy and the leisure time enjoyed by its citizens. Similarly, the Roman Empire, with its vast territories and insatiable appetite for conquest, relied heavily on a slave-based economy. Slaves, often captives of war, fueled the Roman war machine, toiled in mines and on latifundia, and served the needs of the Roman elite. The treatment of slaves in both Greece and Rome could be brutal, with punishments ranging from beatings to death. Yet there were also instances of slaves gaining their freedom or achieving positions of influence. The complexities of slavery in these civilizations highlight the nuanced and often contradictory nature of human history. Section 3. Across continents, slavery in ancient Mesopotamia, China, and the Americas. Beyond the shores of the Mediterranean, slavery was deeply entrenched in other ancient civilizations. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, slavery dates back to the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known sets of written laws. Slaves, often debtors or prisoners of war, served in households, worked on land, and were even employed in temple construction. In ancient China, various forms of servitude and forced labor existed, from penal slavery to debt bondage. Large-scale projects such as the construction of the Great Wall relied heavily on the labor of conscripts and forced laborers. Across the Pacific Ocean in the Americas, civilizations like the Maya and the Inca also practiced forms of slavery. Slaves were typically captives of war or criminals, and they were employed in agriculture, mining, and domestic service. These diverse examples demonstrate the global reach of slavery in ancient times, underscoring its pervasive presence across different cultures and continents. Section 1. The backbone of empires. Economic significance of slavery. Slavery, in its most brutal form, was the engine that powered the economies of many ancient empires. It provided a vast, unpaid workforce that fueled agricultural production, infrastructure projects, and even artistic endeavors. In ancient Rome, for example, the massive agricultural estates known as latifundia relied almost entirely on slave labor to produce grain, olives, and wine for the empire. These goods, in turn, flowed into the cities, feeding the Roman populace and generating wealth for the ruling class. Similarly, the construction of monumental structures like the Colosseum and the Pantheon would have been unthinkable without the toil of countless slaves. From quarrying the stone to hauling the massive blocks, slaves formed the backbone of the Roman construction industry. The economic dependence on slavery was so deeply entrenched that it shaped not only the economic landscape but also the social and political structures of these societies. The wealth generated by slave labor created a wealthy elite who held disproportionate power and influence. This economic disparity fueled social stratification and reinforced existing hierarchies, making it even more challenging to dismantle the institution of slavery. Section 2. Justifying the unjustifiable cultural rationalizations for slavery. The horrors of slavery were often masked by a web of cultural rationalizations and justifications. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Aristotle argued that some individuals were naturally predisposed to be slaves, possessing inferior intellects and lacking the capacity for self-governance. This concept of natural slavery was used to legitimize the enslavement of conquered peoples, who were deemed unfit for citizenship or freedom. In other societies, religious beliefs were invoked to justify slavery. Slaves were sometimes seen as instruments of divine will, their subjugation a reflection of a divinely ordained social order. These justifications, however flawed and morally reprehensible by modern standards, demonstrate how deeply ingrained slavery was in the cultural fabric of these societies. By dehumanizing slaves and portraying them as inherently inferior or deserving of their fate, slave owners could reconcile their actions with their own moral compasses, however distorted. These cultural narratives serve as a stark reminder of the insidious nature of prejudice and the dangers of using ideology to justify exploitation. Section 3. The price of freedom, economic impact of abolition. The road to abolition was long and arduous, marked by fierce resistance and profound economic upheaval. As moral arguments against slavery gained traction, so too did concerns about the economic implications of dismantling a system so deeply embedded in the global economy. The economies of many nations, particularly those built on cash crops like cotton and sugar, were heavily reliant on slave labor. Plantation owners and industrialists argued that abolition would lead to economic collapse, decimating industries and leaving nations vulnerable to competition. In some cases, governments and rulers offered financial incentives to slave owners to encourage emancipation, acknowledging the economic value of the enslaved population. The abolition of slavery, while a moral triumph, also necessitated a fundamental restructuring of economic systems. It forced societies to confront the true cost of their prosperity and to find new ways to organize labor and production. The legacy of this economic transition is still felt today as we continue to grapple with the deep-seated economic disparities rooted in centuries of exploitation and inequality. Section 1. A global affliction. A pervasive misconception about slavery is its confinement to a narrative of black and white. This dangerous simplification ignores the vast historical context and the many cultures and ethnicities impacted by this brutal system. Slavery was not born in the Americas, nor was it solely directed at one specific race. It existed centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, affecting people of all colors and creeds across the globe. To fully grasp the true nature of slavery, we must shed the lens of modern racial biases and examine its roots in antiquity. From the Roman Empire, where people from across Europe and the Mediterranean were enslaved, to the Ottoman Empire, where slaves came from Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Africa, the victims of slavery were a diverse group. This historical reality challenges the misconception that slavery was a uniquely European crime against Africans. It underscores the uncomfortable truth that the capacity for cruelty and exploitation is not limited to one race or culture. Section 2. The transatlantic slave trade, a catalyst for distortion. While slavery has plagued humanity for millennia, the transatlantic slave trade undeniably stands as one of its most brutal and impactful chapters. The scale, duration, and systematic dehumanization of Africans during this period are horrific beyond measure. This period, tragically, has come to dominate the modern perception of slavery, leading to a skewed understanding of its historical breadth. The transatlantic slave trade's focus on African slaves and its association with European colonialism have, in many ways, overshadowed other forms of slavery. This focus, while crucial to understanding the horrors inflicted on Africans, has inadvertently created a narrative that minimizes the suffering of other groups enslaved throughout history. Section 3. Beyond the black and white narrative. It is crucial to remember that the legacy of slavery extends far beyond the transatlantic slave trade. In the Americas, for example, indigenous populations were enslaved by European colonizers long before the arrival of African slaves. In the Ottoman Empire, the enslavement of Circassians, Georgians, and other groups from the Caucasus region was a significant part of the slave trade. Similarly, the Arab slave trade, which spanned centuries, involved the enslavement of people from Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe and Asia. These examples, often overlooked, highlight the importance of understanding slavery as a global phenomenon that has impacted countless cultures and ethnicities throughout history. To truly combat its legacy and prevent its resurgence, we must acknowledge its full scope recognizing the suffering of all victims and challenging the dangerous simplification of a black and white narrative. Section 1. Seeds of Change, Early Opposition to Slavery. The institution of slavery, despite its long and pervasive history, was never without its critics. Even in ancient times, voices of dissent emerged, challenging the morality and legitimacy of human bondage. These early seeds of change, though often drowned out by the prevailing winds of power and economic expediency, represented a flickering flame of conscience that would eventually ignite powerful movements for liberation. In ancient Greece, the philosopher Stoicism, with its emphasis on the universal brotherhood of humanity, provided a philosophical framework for questioning the morality of slavery. Stoic philosophers argued that all humans, regardless of their social standing or circumstance, possessed an inherent dignity and were deserving of respect. While these ideas did not lead to widespread abolition in ancient Greece, they helped to plant the seeds of doubt about the righteousness of slavery. Similarly, in the Roman Empire, some emperors, such as Claudius, enacted laws to mitigate the worst abuses of slavery, demonstrating a growing awareness of the ethical dilemmas posed by the practice. These early stirrings of moral conscience, though often limited in their immediate impact, helped to chip away at the foundations of slavery, paving the way for more organized and sustained efforts to dismantle this unjust system. Section 2. A Force for Liberation, the Rise of Abolition Movements. As centuries passed, the moral arguments against slavery gained momentum, fueled by Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and human rights. The 18th century witnessed the rise of organized abolition movements, particularly in Europe and North America, that sought to abolish slavery in all its forms. These movements, often led by writers, intellectuals, and former slaves, used the power of the pen and the platform of public discourse to expose the horrors of slavery and to advocate for its abolition. Figures like Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who became a prominent abolitionist writer, shared their harrowing experiences of captivity, challenging the conscience of a world that had long turned a blind eye to the plight of the enslaved. Abolitionists organized petitions, boycotts of goods produced by slave labor, and public demonstrations to raise awareness and to pressure governments to enact anti-slavery legislation. Their efforts were met with fierce resistance from those who profited from the slave trade and from those who clung to the racist ideologies used to justify it. Despite the challenges and setbacks, the abolition movement grew in strength and influence, ultimately leading to the abolition of slavery in most parts of the world by the end of the 19th century. Section 3. The Long Road to Freedom, Legal Milestones and Enduring Challenges. The fight for abolition was a long and arduous journey, marked by both significant legal victories and persistent challenges. The passage of the Slavery Abolition Act in the British Empire in 1833, followed by the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States in 1863, marked watershed moments in the global struggle against slavery. These landmark acts, though imperfect in their implementation, represented a decisive shift in legal and moral norms, recognizing the inherent right of all people to be free from bondage. However, the abolition of slavery did not erase the deep-seated legacies of racism and inequality that had fueled its existence for centuries. In many parts of the world, former slaves faced continued discrimination, economic marginalization, and violence. The struggle for true equality and justice continued long after the formal abolition of slavery, as societies grappled with the task of dismantling the social, economic, and political structures that had perpetuated this inhumane system. The legacy of slavery continues to cast a long shadow on the world today, reminding us that the fight for human rights and dignity is an ongoing struggle that demands constant vigilance and unwavering commitment. Section 1. A Shadow Unfaded. While the abolition of slavery in the 19th century marked a significant triumph for humanity, the scourge of forced labor, human trafficking, and exploitation continues to plague the modern world. The shadows of this ancient evil have not faded, they have merely shifted and taken on new, insidious forms. Today, millions of people around the globe are trapped in various forms of modern slavery, stripped of their freedom and dignity. Driven by greed, inequality, and a callous disregard for human rights, this illicit industry flourishes in the shadows, generating billions of dollars in profits for exploiters, from sweatshops hidden in plain sight to forced prostitution rings operating across borders. Modern slavery is a pervasive and complex issue that demands our attention. It is a stark reminder that the fight for freedom is far from over, and that the chains of oppression can take many forms. We must confront this uncomfortable truth and acknowledge that the legacy of slavery continues to haunt our world, perpetuating cycles of poverty, inequality, and human suffering. Modern slavery manifests in countless ways, each more horrific than the last. One of its most prevalent forms is forced labor, where individuals are coerced into working against their will, often under threat of violence or retribution against their families. They may toil in factories, fields, mines, or private homes, enduring grueling hours, unsafe conditions, and little or no pay. The fishing industry, with its reliance on migrant labor and its operations far from shore, has emerged as a breeding ground for forced labor, trapping vulnerable workers at sea for months or even years. Another horrific manifestation of modern slavery is sex trafficking, where individuals, predominantly women and children, are coerced or deceived into commercial sex work. They are often lured with false promises of a better life, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of exploitation and abuse. The internet, with its cloak of anonymity, has become a hunting ground for traffickers who prey on vulnerable individuals online, grooming them and luring them into dangerous situations. Section 3. Breaking the chains of exploitation. The fight against modern slavery requires a multifaceted approach that addresses the root causes of this global epidemic. Poverty, lack of education, conflict, and discrimination create an environment where vulnerable individuals are more susceptible to exploitation. Investing in education, promoting economic opportunities, and empowering marginalized communities are crucial steps in breaking the cycle of poverty and reducing vulnerability to trafficking. Strengthening law enforcement efforts, both domestically and internationally, is essential to dismantling criminal networks involved in trafficking and bringing perpetrators to justice. This includes enhancing border controls, improving intelligence sharing, and increasing prosecutions for trafficking offenses. However, law enforcement alone is not enough. We must also address the demand side of the equation by raising awareness about the products and services that may be tainted by forced labor. Consumers have the power to influence corporate behavior by demanding transparency and ethical sourcing practices from the companies they support. Section 1. A Shared Responsibility. The journey through the history of slavery, from its ancient roots to its modern manifestations, is a harrowing reminder of the capacity for cruelty that resides within humanity. It is a story of power imbalances, of greed and indifference, and of the systematic dehumanization of fellow human beings. As we have seen, slavery is not confined to a particular time or place, nor is it a relic of the past. It continues to cast a long shadow over our world, thriving in the darkness of ignorance and apathy. The fight for freedom, for dignity, and for basic human rights is a shared responsibility that transcends borders, cultures, and generations. We must acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that the legacy of slavery continues to shape our world, fueling inequality, poverty, and conflict. Only by confronting this dark chapter of our past can we hope to create a future where every human being is free to live a life of dignity and opportunity. Section 2. Echoes of Injustice. The echoes of injustice reverberate through time, reminding us that the fight for freedom is far from over. The chains of slavery may have taken on new forms, but the underlying forces of greed, exploitation, and indifference remain unchanged. Millions of people around the world continue to be trapped in various forms of modern slavery, their lives and dreams held hostage by those who seek to profit from their misery. From the sweatshops where workers toil in inhumane conditions, to the brothels where women and children are sold into sexual exploitation, the face of slavery today is as diverse as the victims it claims. We must remember that behind the statistics and the headlines are real people, each with their own story of suffering and resilience. Their voices, often silenced by fear and oppression, deserve to be heard. Their stories demand our attention, our empathy, and our unwavering commitment to action. Section 3. A call to action. The fight against slavery is not a spectator sport. It is a call to action that demands the engagement of each and every one of us. We must educate ourselves about the various forms of modern slavery and the factors that contribute to its persistence. We must support organizations working on the front lines to rescue victims, provide them with support, and bring perpetrators to justice. We can make conscious choices as consumers, demanding transparency and ethical sourcing practices from the companies we support. We can use our voices to advocate for stronger laws and policies to combat trafficking and protect the rights of vulnerable populations. Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference in the lives of those who are trapped in slavery. By working together, we can create a world where freedom rings true for all, and where the legacy of slavery is finally consigned to the history books. Let us be the generation that breaks the chains of exploitation and builds a future where every human being is free to live a life of dignity and opportunity.